Welcome everyone to this special episode of Irreverent Faith and Current Affairs. We are conducting today an in-person interview here in this lovely church in Winchester with Lord Frost. So we're going to be talking about faith and politics and the interplay between the two, and I'm sure we're going to get into all sorts of very, very interesting subject matter. But just to begin with, let's just say, Lord Frost, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much for coming.
Not at all, it's a pleasure. Great to be here. Thank you, Jamie.
Fantastic, brilliant. Well, David, if I may, if that's all right, let's begin with this question of faith then, speaking first about personal faith before we speak about the political realm. Now, some people will be aware that, I think it was at Easter, you were received into the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I think that'd be a really interesting place to start. Is Christian faith something that's come about recently for you, or has that been a longer journey? And can you tell us something about it?
Well, it's kind of both, I guess. I was a Christian at university in the Church of England, and I guess drifted away, as so many people do, when working life began. And although I guess I was never entirely kind of outside the Christian world, nevertheless, I was certainly not a believer. And I think, really it was lockdown that it got me thinking again, and actually listening to some of the things you were saying on the podcasts and others really got me thinking, I suppose there's more, surely the sense that something very odd had been released into human life through the podcast. These strange restrictions, these, the inability to talk to people, the inability to go anywhere, all of this. And I heard you on the podcast with Tom and Daniel kind of talking about some of this. And that was the thing that, honestly, that kind of got me reflecting on this. And really since then, over the last 5 years, I guess it's been a bit of a journey. And I've read a lot and thought a lot. And so, yes, I've ended up in the Catholic Church. And I could talk a bit about the journey in a bit more depth, if you like.
Yeah, well, I'd like to do that. But I mean, can we just dig into this a little bit, because I'm sure many people here will actually identify with what you've just said. We've had many people email us with and get in touch in other ways with similar stories of coming back to the faith, really as a result of that strange period during the time of COVID. I think a lot of people have said that it's they experienced a kind of shaking of the foundations of their worldview almost, that I think for some people, they were quite frightened and worried about what was actually going on in the world, and they started to ask themselves big questions around the existence of good and evil, the ultimate purpose of life and things of this sort. Is that the sort of thing you mean when you talk about the exploration of faith happening at the time of COVID, or how would you articulate that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. The sense that there were sort of forces outside ourselves for the first time had become kind of visible, and I didn't really have the language or the knowledge to articulate it properly, but definitely that sense. And in an odd way, the fact that the Church of England kind of shut up shop for those few months, in a way, I mean, I think it was obviously a mistake to have done so, but nevertheless, it posed the question. It forced you to ask yourself the question, well, look, there's a matter, these are matters of life and death. The church has shut up shop. Why? I have got to think about it myself. Why has it done that? What conclusions do I come to as a result of this? So in a way, although I wouldn't have wanted it, it kind of forced me to think in a way that I might not have otherwise.
Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like the closure of the church is almost, in some ways, raises the question of well, what is the value of the church anyway? Why am I so upset about this? Or
that's right. Exactly right. Exactly right. It forced you to think what is important about it, and why am I so bothered that the church, you can't go into a church? Why does that feel so unnatural? And, I guess a lot of people just took it from there, I think.
So really, it was actually a clever marketing strategy by Justin Welby to close the churches.
You can turn anything to good, I suppose. That's the answer.
Yeah, very much so. Well, there is a scriptural verse that says just that. But let's talk about then the following years then. So it's culminated in you. Were you confirmed into the Roman Catholic Church? Were you received, or what happened? You were received.
Yes, I was actually baptized a Methodist when I was a baby, but yes, received into the church.
So what was the process that led you specifically to the Roman Catholic Church as opposed to the Church of England, for example?
Yeah, I mean, the journey could have ended anywhere, I guess, or at least I didn't know where it was going to end when it started, I suppose, is the honest question. I think there were kind of three things which were important to me on the journey and probably destined me to end up in the Catholic Church rather than elsewhere. And it's, I mean, I don't know whether you find this talking to people, Jamie, but it's always a bit awkward talking about one's own kind of spiritual journey a bit, and there are some things you don't necessarily want to talk about. But I think there were three sort of things for me. One being sacramentalism, the whole re-enchanting vibe, I guess, that's so prominent at the moment. And I guess this sense that I suddenly realized that intelligent people could take this seriously. That there was a worldview that said, this world isn't all there is. And not only that God sort of permeates it rather than kind of setting the clock going and then standing back to see what happens. And the fact that I suddenly realized that was a reputable thing to think. Intelligent people thought this, and it was perfectly possible to pursue that. So that's one thing.
So may I ask, who were the intelligent people, apart from us, obviously, in the podcast, who were the intelligent people that you were coming across?
So, I did read quite a lot on that, and I think Bishop Barron, obviously lots of people I think are influenced by Robert Barron. Rod Dreher, in a different kind of way. There's a guy called Erik Varden, who's a bishop, Norwegian bishop, who's written a lot. I found his writings very kind of touching and interesting. So all of those, really.
Very good, very good.
And then I think second thing is like the Gospels themselves and the Bible themselves. And one of the things that I guess drove me out of, well, it didn't quite drive me out, but just made me kind of give up when I was much younger, was that the more I read around the Gospels and the more commentaries I read on them and the more theological works I read about them, the less possible it seemed to take them seriously, because the worldview at the time among so many theologians was, you can't really trust the Gospels as serious accounts of what happened. They're kind of compiled from bits and bobs that people remembered and assembled to make up a story that seemed plausible to them at the time. But they're not in any meaningful sense a kind of record of a life, and you can't really trust it. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the message I got. And then when I came back to them, 3 or 4 years ago, it seemed like opinion had completely changed, that there'd been a complete swing round in the theological view of the Gospels and commentary to think it's perfectly possible to take them seriously as biographies, as eyewitness accounts to a very large extent. And in a way, when you read them, and particularly if you read a Gospel all the way through, I find it incredible that anybody could really have thought that they were just kind of, patchwork together, because they're just so obviously, to me, biographical eyewitness accounts, and there are things in them that just, there's no reason why they should be in them other than that's what happened. So I remember one of the things that struck me was, I think it's Mark's Gospel, where Jesus cures the blind man at Bethsaida, and he rubs mud into the eye and says, "Can you see?" And he says, "It's like I can sort of see. It's like trees walking around." That's what he says about the people, and that particular remark really struck me. Like that is obviously what he said. Nobody's going to have made that up if the purpose of the story was purely sort of theological. And there's so much in it that is. Just inherently plausible, like that. So I suppose that's right. The ring of truth, exactly. So that was very important, and then I think, it comes back to where we started. I suppose this sense that there's a kind of thing at the moment about cultural Christianity, and there've been quite a few converts who, the commentary about them has been they've converted because they think Christianity is an important element of Western civilization, but they're in it for the civilization rather than the Christianity. And, I must admit, I went through a phase of thinking something like that on my journey, that, wouldn't it be good if society was a bit more Christian? Obviously, I don't want to go to church myself. That's a bit too much, but it would be better if everybody else did. Like, is it Voltaire, I can't remember, who says he wants his lawyer and his valet to be Christian because then they won't rob him. But, he doesn't really feel the need to believe it himself. And I think actually the level of disturbance in society at the moment is so great that a lot of people will be drawn in by something like that. But obviously it's important not to stop there. I think that's the thing, that the disturbance comes because society has moved away from Christianity. It's Christianity that's the important thing. It's not, Christianity isn't there to support the civilization. It's the thing that helped make the civilization, and the disturbance comes from moving away from Christianity, and that's really what I came to think. So that's a sort of long-winded way of those are the three kind of things that brought me on the journey. And to answer your original question, they're all things I think that kind of help a Catholic sensibility. The rootedness in history and tradition, the sacramentalism, and of course the Catholic Church itself, I think, is the dominant institution of Western civilization. I guess it's kind of been fundamental to it for so long. So all of those things, I guess, took me in a Catholic direction, and that's why I ended up a Roman Catholic.
Indeed, it all makes perfect sense. There are many things that we could talk about, and I think we should come to talk about this question of cultural Christianity and the interplay between the faith and the public square in a moment. But let me just ask you this, just about that specifically. Many people will associate you with Brexit, with not being massively in favour of the EU, let's say. Sometimes people see an analogy between Roman Catholicism and globalism, let's say, just broadly speaking, and an analogy between a more sort of nationalist politics and being a member of a church, in England anyway, a member of a Church of England church. So how does that work for you? Why didn't you simply gravitate to the national church rather than the sort of European superpower, as it were? Do you see any incongruence there?
It's the international institution par excellence, the Roman Catholic Church, and people did draw analogies. In fact, we kind of internally would jokingly draw analogies, to Henry VIII and the Statutes Praemunire. In fact, I think Boris said some of this in public. No foreign court has jurisdiction in the realm of England, and so on and so forth. And those analogies certainly exist, but I think they're obviously analogies for another time when the Roman Catholic Church was a completely different kind of institution. And one of the things that frustrates me and still frustrates me, I admit, from a personal point of view, is this sense that, a lot of people have this image of me as somebody who just doesn't like foreigners. And, Brexit was about, getting, sort of stopping foreign, to try and sort of get away from foreigners. And I find that very exasperating because it seems obvious to me you can like European political culture, you can love European civilization, you can speak a few European languages like I do without having to believe in the European Union as a political institution, which is a very recent and a very unusual kind of political experiment in Europe. So, what I've always seen part of Brexit as is trying to show that nation states and national cultures can have a place in a modern Europe. You don't have to buy into the EU as an institution to be a reputable, European in good standing. And so that's why I think, although the analogy exists, I think it's not quite a fair one in that sense. Yeah.
What do you think about, given what you've just said, what do you think about the concept of Christian nationalism? Do you have a problem with that phrase, or is it something that you would accept, or how do you feel about it?
I don't really like the phrase, I admit. I think nationalism, has become a kind of negative word generally for, not entirely bad reasons, obviously, but it's a word that is negative. I don't like it because it identifies Christianity with a nation, and I don't think that's quite right, personally. I think I personally believe the nation state is the best way people have found to kind of organize their political life and culture. And the move away from a nation state is a problem. But I see that as a kind of, organizational political question rather than a religious one. Yeah. I think it just takes you a bit too close to, a sense that, only Christians are good citizens of a country. Right. I suppose that's where it kind of takes you on a direction to, and I don't think that, and I don't think most people think that. Because some people who might propose something like Christian nationalism would want to make something more. Well, they might want to make something more. They might want to make a biblical case and say, draw analogies between, for example, the nation of Israel and modern nation states. Or they might want to say that a nation state has a more tangible ontology than, rather just being a kind of political organization that happens to work. I think somebody like Yoram Hazony would want to make a case like that. Yeah. So you would want to distinguish your view from somebody like that, would you? Yoram Hazony, I think, makes quite a strong case that the origins of the concepts of the nation come from Judaism and from Israel in the first millennium BC, and contrast that with the sort of empire form of political organization. And I'm sure he's right about that. I think it's more just the risk that in the modern environment, Christian nationalism conveys something that I don't think is a good concept. It's not that a nation state is an un-Christian thing. I absolutely do not think that, obviously. And I think successful nation states in Europe have been reinforced by Christianity. But I think it's just that particular phrase is so often used as a rather exclusionary sort of phrase. And I think we should try and find better words for our concepts. I never use the word nationalism, or at least I try not to. I always talk about nationhood rather than nationalism. And it feels to me, okay, it's only words, but it feels like a kind of warmer word than nationalism to convey what I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I mean, I suppose what I'd really like to ask you is how then you see the role of Christianity in the public square. I mean, one of the most important interventions recently was, of course, Danny Kruger's speech in the House of Commons. And of course, he's named very much in the news at the moment. He gave this speech. It was symbolically quite resonant, I thought, because the House of Commons was essentially empty. There were sort of 8 people in the entire chamber. And he gave this speech where he essentially said that we used to be a Christian, I mean, this is simplified, obviously, but we used to be a Christian nation. We decided at some point, maybe in the last century, that we could have a kind of neutral politics. And into that neutrality has come 2 things, Islam and, you know, in a roundabout way he called, you know, the religion of wokeism or whatever it might be. And he was essentially saying, you know, we need to return to thinking of ourselves as a sort of self-consciously Christian nation, you know, in terms of our law, in terms of our policies, in terms of our relationship with the Church of England, perhaps the Church more broadly as well. Did you agree with what Danny Kruger said? Is that the way you see it, or how do you see that relationship?
Yeah, I basically do,
Yeah.
and I thought it was interesting that speech, you know, seemed to get such a wide pickup, and I'm not sure that would have been true 5 or 10 years ago. Actually, yeah. I think there is something going on that people are interested in for all kinds of reasons at the moment. I mean, it seems obvious to me that, you know, the English nation, the British nation, is deeply identified and formed by Christianity in its form, the form that it developed in these islands. And, you know, France is formed by its Christian background and so on and so forth. And I think if you try and take that out of a national culture and a national identity, you risk, you know, taking away a huge part of what makes a nation. And you don't have to be a Christian believer to believe that that's an important part of, you know, what holds people together in a meaningful nation and makes people want to make sacrifices for each other and generally get along and, you know, make Britain a worthwhile project. So I do agree with him on that. We haven't really run the experiment for long enough yet of what happens if you take Christianity out of a culture and just have a kind of neutral space in which everybody kind of competes with whatever idea. But to the extent we have run it, I don't think the results are very good so far, and they're probably going to get worse if we carry on. And I think that's a bit what people are picking up. You know, the interest in nationhood, in history, the sense that something is missing is, I think, connected to this, you know, very overt driving secularization of ideas that we've got at the moment. Yeah. So it worries me, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem to me, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, but it does seem to me to be the case that if you truly try and implement something like this idea of a sort of neutral public space, then that it might sort of be sustainable for a certain amount of time, but after a while, some kind of more dominant or perhaps aggressive ideology will come and seek to fill that space. An example I always give of this is Michel Houellebecq's excellent novel Submission, where he imagines an Islamic party coming to power in France and then, you know, immediately taking over all the educational institutions and various other changes happening in society and so on. But it doesn't have to be Islam. It could be a version of, you know, woke identity politics or something like that. It seems to me to be an inherent flaw, an inherent vulnerability within the liberal worldview in that sense. You know, if you have a neutral public space where every idea is welcome, then on the face of it, that means more aggressive and more dominant imperialistic ideas will eventually come and fill that space. Is that the way you see it?
I mean, I think there's a risk, obviously, and it's more of a risk if you know, Christians themselves or you know, the representatives of Christianity in its kind of institutional form, if they seem not to be strongly believing in it either, then obviously that's even higher risk, because the competition, is then not a strong one. I think, the religious, in terms of religion and beliefs, transcendental beliefs, whatever, it seems to me people will always want to believe in something. And, you take Christianity out and people will find something else to fill the gap, just as at the secular level. If you destroy the concept of a meaningful nation, then people still want to identify with something. They will identify with their ethnic group or whatever, and that's what we're seeing happening in Britain. So I think these two things do go together.
Yeah, indeed. Let's talk about the current political situation as a continuation of this discussion then. The moment Reform are surging in the polls, I think, and you may agree with this, I think many people are looking for a more self-consciously Christian form of politics, or at least a self-consciously Christian engagement in the political square, which is a little bit more robust and forthright. People are looking to Reform to bring about some kind of salvation from the obvious turmoil that we're in so many ways at the moment. But in many ways, Reform doesn't seem to be, the equivalent of the kind of Christian politics you get in America, for example. Farage is not really a straightforwardly Christian figure in any sense. We've just this week had the high-profile defection of Danny Kruger from the Conservative Party to Reform. Danny seems to represent something slightly different to Nigel. So what do you see there? Is there any hope for people who are looking for that Christian engagement in the public square from Reform, or how do you see that working?
So I think the important thing is that Christians of all parties should feel, more able to be honest about their belief. And definitely that's not the case at the moment, although it's probably a bit easier, it's my impression anyway, it's a bit easier to talk about Christianity and politics and your personal faith than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And you do hear people doing that, and in the Lib Dems, in Labour, as well as on the right. I don't think any individual political party is going to, nor should it, be identified with a kind of Christian worldview. I think it's important that it comes through into politics as a whole. I think, I could wish for a bit more Christian charity, I suppose, in the political debate sometimes, which does sometimes feel, extremely brutal and negative. But I think the strength of Reform, and indeed of the bit of the Conservative Party that I see myself on, is that it's offering, answers to the questions that the country needs to hear politically, economically, to some extent culturally, social conservatism. But I don't think we will get anywhere like, the American style of Christian politics. And I think most people probably don't want that either here. Why do you think Danny Kruger decided to move from Conservative to Reform, and what kind of influence do you think he thinks he can have in Reform now? Yeah, well, from his public statements, I suppose what's interesting about Danny's move is that, I'm trying to find the right words. He's not the kind of person that a lot of people typically identify with the Reform Party. So that's what's made it unusual. In his speech, in his writings, his Spectator article today, he talks about the flame of conservatism having moved from the Conservative Party to the Reform Party, that the Conservative Party is done for a mix of reasons. And, if you want conservatism to to continue. He says the Reform Party is the only way forward. Danny's view of conservatism, I share quite a lot of it, but I don't probably share everything that he advocates. And there are a number of strands of conservatism on the broad centre-right that I think need to be picked up and taken forward. He thinks he can do that more effectively in reform. Let's see. I mean, there's a lot up for grabs at the moment in British politics.
Yes, there is indeed. Now, David, I have to ask you this question because if I don't, somebody else here will during the Q&A. But in the light of Danny Kruger moving over to reform and your comments about it, specifically in the Telegraph, many people are speculating that you might be next. So will you be next, and are you planning on joining reform?
I have no plans to join reform. I mean, honestly, you can't do, for one thing, you can't do real politics in the Lords, and that is a constraint. Second, I think what I'm best able to do is articulate the ideas, and I think there are a set of ideas that need to be heard and are only uncertainly being picked up, probably by both Conservatives and Reform. And my view of that is that we need a stronger nation, a more effective kind of government machine in various ways, but we also need a smaller state and more personal freedom, more free market economics, and that those things don't they're not opposites, they go together to make a successful country. And I'm not sure where those ideas are going to be best picked up, if they are picked up at all. But anyway, I want to go on articulating them and sort of see what emerges out of this turmoil on the right. There's no doubt the Conservative Party in a very serious, difficult situation. Whatever one thinks of the leader, the important thing is the poll ratings. The poll ratings keep going down. They've gone down consistently for getting on for a year now, and there's no sign that they're going to stop. And that brutally, politics is about your ability to elect people. And if you can't elect people, then you don't count. And we're not quite at that point yet, but we could be soon.
It's particular. I don't want to stick the knife in, but it's particular. You pointed this out yourself. In fact, it's particularly crushing, isn't it, that Danny Kruger was Jenric's campaign manager, and many people are looking to Jenric as really the only hope for the Conservative Party. So there's something particularly galling about it from that perspective, in terms of getting him. Well, in terms of what Kruger himself thinks about the prospects of Jenric becoming the leader and affecting change.
Well, indeed, as I pointed out, I think that's one obvious conclusion you can draw, that he thinks it's going to be difficult for Rob to become leader, or if he does, to be able to accomplish the kind of change in the party that he wants. I think Danny, I mean, I can't speak for him, obviously, but I think his basic view is just that, the Conservative Party has kind of passed below the event horizon. It can't get out again, and it's done for. And as I say, that could happen, but I think most of us don't think it quite has to happen yet. And there is still a possibility of getting the Conservative Party into a more conservative position on things that matter. And that's what I keep trying to do. Yeah.
Well, you're making a valiant effort. Let me ask you about the Lords then. So we're recording on Thursday, the 18th of September. Tomorrow is the second session of the second reading of the Assisted Dying Bill in the House of Lords, and I believe you are going to be speaking in that session. You're going to speak tomorrow. What are you going to say?
I've not entirely made my mind up yet, I must say, but I think I will. I mean, we've had like 80 speakers already, so almost every argument has been made and heard already. I think, my view, and I think I'll say some version of this, is that you can't. Well, obviously, I think believing Christians cannot support assisted suicide. I'd take that as a given. I think the argument I try and make is that even if you're not, you should be very nervous about this attempt to dispense with an important part of Judeo-Christian ethics, because if we are showing that we can kind of make up ethics as we go along because it's convenient, then what protection does any of us have? Once you can chuck out one thing, you can chuck out something else, and then it may be something you think is important. What protection do the elderly, the disabled, whatever, have just the unpopular have if morality is entirely made up by the utilitarian government and whatever happens to be convenient at any point in time? So that's why I think we should all be worried about this attempt to move away from the inherited ethical norms of Judeo-Christian tradition. I think that's what I'll try and say, because so much of the argument has been people saying, I'm not a religious believer, why should I care? I care about my autonomy and my dignity and that of my relatives. But who says autonomy and dignity are important things? No one, apart from the Judeo-Christian ethical tradition. And once you start knocking that away, then what basis have you got to protect anything? And that's why I find this bill so troubling, and why I think people who aren't religious believers should also feel extremely troubled by it. So that's an inarticulate view, probably, of what I'll try and say tomorrow.
It seems to me to be one of these issues where it really does bring out the question of the interplay between Christianity and politics, because even in secular arguments, as you've just said, even in sort of secular, atheistic arguments for it, people always feel the need to say, I don't believe in God. In fact, there was an article which was widely shared on X today, which I think was from the New Statesman, which did just that. Even though it was not a very well written or argued article, it's almost like people recognise that in some sense you have to deal with the metaphysical and religious question first before you then say, and this is why we should have the state killing people. That's right. Because I suppose because it's a sufficiently serious question of life and death, it naturally brings that question into people's minds. Is there a God? What is the status of human beings? Is there something sacred about us? Are we made in the image of God, or are we just a sort of sack of chemicals? And when we're suffering and when there's no hope of recovery, should we simply end our lives? So it's got all of those things together, hasn't it?
It has, and I think the debate in Lords has, by and large, been quite high quality so far. For that reason, it has been quite thoughtful. People have been thinking quite carefully about it, and I suppose it's a bit like the lockdowns and COVID in the sense that you can't avoid confronting these questions, as you say. It has to be a kind of prior thing that you think about if you're going to say anything at all on the subject. But people do move on quite quickly from that and get to the kind of utilitarian basics of it. And the article in the New Statesman, the one I think you're referring to, is really quite appalling. But it's not been the only article like that, and it shows where this takes you. People are quite happy to go down this road if it's convenient for them, or some people are. And I at least have a extremely sort of sharp negative reaction when I read that sort of thing, and I'm sure lots of others do as well.
I think it's the sort of stark economic utilitarianism of it. Matthew Paris wrote an article, it was quite a long time ago now, but essentially saying a similar thing, which is that, if the elderly are in a drain on the economy and they have a very low quality of life anyway, then essentially the economic argument for something like assisted suicide becomes more plausible. And what I tweeted today about that is that the only thing that article gets correct, in my view, is that if you really don't believe in God, and if you think that man has no sacred status, then it opens the way to making such an argument.
Yes.
So really the ethics and the politics is downstream of the metaphysics in that sense.
That's right, but most people at the moment are unwilling to make those arguments.
Yeah.
They may claim that they don't have a metaphysical view, and it's entirely about the economics and so on, but nevertheless most of them are reluctant to go to the logical conclusion of that and say it's okay to kill off people if they are inconvenient to you in some way, even though that is the ultimate logical destination, I think, of these things. There is another argument which is, surprised a lot of us, that Andrew Roberts, Lord Roberts, made in the House last week, which was, almost to say suicide was a positive. He said, get rid of Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and all these people. Let's go back to the Romans and the Greeks, who thought that suicide could be a good thing, a morally strong thing to do in certain circumstances. And that a lot of people were quite surprised to hear that. But again, if you're allowed to make these things up as you go along, why not? There are plenty of other ethical codes to choose from if you don't like Christianity. And what stops you going to them? Only belief and a sense of where it might take you, and those are all eroding fast.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I didn't actually know that. Because I was thinking that you do get those kind of stark economic utilitarian arguments, but then you also get the sort of what would you call them, sort of quasi or crypto Christian arguments, which is this is about showing compassion, this is about showing love for people, and I don't doubt. I'd be interested to know your view on this, but I don't doubt that those arguments are often sincerely meant.
Yes.
And even if one disagrees with them, one can still say these people are sincere. They are, in my view, misguided, but they still mean these things. But the problem with it is what it will lead to, which is clearly a sort of nightmarish proliferation of this practice, which will far exceed the boundaries, which are completely arbitrary, which are being drawn around it at the moment. So that's a real concern.
I think so. It's that's obviously the most difficult aspect of this debate. People who are in real pain have real difficult lives, and we all fear that for ourselves. That's why it's such a powerful argument. And it is very difficult in modern culture to make the argument. Trying to relieve pain is not the only thing that you have to think about, and it's extremely countercultural, and it can sound very brutal to say it, but it's like Chesterton's fence, his story that probably many of you know, his sort of analogy that don't take the fence down until you're absolutely sure why it was put up. It may be doing something that you can't work out, so don't do it if you don't have to. And I think that this debate has something of that character. What looks like a reasonable decision to relieve pain, once it becomes policy, once it becomes practice, can take you to places you don't need to go and unexpected destinations that are very problematic. And the only thing you've got to stop you is the inherited Judeo-Christian ethical tradition, and saying that must be there for a reason. It's worked out quite well for the last 2,000 years, basically. Let's hang on to it. And that is really the only argument you have.
Yes, indeed. What do you think personally is going to happen? Do you think this is just going to go through? Is there any hope that it might be forestalled by the Lords?
I think we've got some chance of stopping it entirely. It looks like there's now going to be this will be decided tomorrow, so we will know by then, but there'll be some sort of select committee that is going to be able to call witnesses, and hopefully a more balanced set of witnesses than the ones that came to the Commons. That will take us towards Christmas, and then the committee stage will start again. So time is beginning to press. There will definitely be hundreds, possibly thousands of amendments to this bill. from all of us. It'll be very difficult. It's very difficult to. There's no guillotine in the Lords. You can't timetable things. In the end, you have to find the time. I think there's a good chance that we'll run out of time, or it will be talked out, or it will be so wrecked, as its proponents would see, with various amendments that the government just gives up, or they give up, and they realise it's a kind of unviable project in its current form. That's what we'll hope, that one of those things will happen. And if it wasn't in the manifesto, it's a free vote, it's a matter of conscience. If the Lords can't make its opinion tell in these circumstances, then what is the House of Lords for? You may as well not have it, I think. So that's why people feel strongly about it.
Well, thank you. I mean, that sounds like we have a reasonable hope there. So
it's definitely worth working at. There's a good chance.
That's good. Before we open things up for Q&A, there are a couple of other things I would like to ask you about. Since we have you here, it's worth asking about Brexit. We're 9 years on now. What do you think's gone wrong with Brexit, and what do you think's gone right with it as well?
Gosh, well, there's a whole book to be written on this subject. No, I think the first thing that went wrong was that we let Theresa May decide how the negotiations were going to be done, and we ended up with this bodge job that wouldn't go through Parliament. The EU rules still prevailing in a lot of Northern Ireland, and the rest of the country locked in. And so when Boris came to power, we were able to chip away at that, but we prioritised by that point, as the Constitution was just disintegrating around us, that we just had to get out and try and fix some of this afterwards. So that's what we did. And obviously it's left us with this legacy of the job not having been done, quite as we would have done it if we'd been in power in 2016, and this legacy of bits of EU law, the Northern Ireland, Great Britain division that has bedeviled us ever since, really, in various ways. The fixing it afterwards turned out to be much more difficult because so much of the Conservative Party didn't want to do it and wasn't willing to force it through. So I think that's the first problem. The second problem was that we didn't do what we could have, even within that framework. And we got a good trade agreement, I think. I still would give us like 8 out of 10 for the whole job, even though the 2/10 turned out to be very important. We didn't exploit the freedoms as we should have. We should have had a much faster rate of regulatory reform. We should have, got rid of net zero much more quickly. We should have reversed a lot of the regulation that the EU had brought in over the years, and we just kind of tinkered around the edges, really. So that meant nobody was really seeing any benefit, and it was very easy to make the case, well, what's really changed, and was it all worth it? And that's now coming through the polls. Was it really worth it? It's making it easy for the current government to say, this was a botched job. What we need to do is get closer again. That will solve all the problems. It won't. It will just accentuate the problems, in fact. But that's where we are. Still, for all of that, whatever you do brings you a set of problems. Those are the problems that this particular form of Brexit brought to us. It is still really important that the country, more or less, can govern itself, is a genuine democracy, more or less, again. And I think we got used to Brexit. And I don't think if Labour had not reopened all this with the reset, I don't know there'd be any great demand to go through it all again. I think the country has kind of gradually got used to it, and having Parliament debating things it didn't used to debate, and governing ourselves. We've also learned, obviously, the ECHR, the Human Rights Convention is a problem. That's going to have to be dealt with. But all this is in our hands. We can do all of these things. We can sweep away the rest of what's there if we wish to. We can leave the ECHR if we want to. We just have to think that being a fully self-governing country again is an important thing to do. And that's what we need to get established on the right and on the patriotic left, which does exist, albeit fragile at the moment, but it does exist. And if we can get back into power in some form again in 27 or 28 or 29, the job has got to be done right then. This has all got to be swept away. The Northern Ireland arrangements, the ECHR, the bits of the UN conventions that constrain us, whatever kind of ghastly thing has been visited on us in the reset between now and then, it all has to be swept away. It's got to be 100% clear in the manifesto and in the campaigns that that's what's going to happen. And there needs to be full control of the civil service and the bureaucracy to make it happen. That's that. Otherwise, what Boris always called the EU tractor beam pulls you back in. We didn't quite get escape velocity, unfortunately. And now, unless we can summon up another effort, we're going to get pulled back. And that really is the most important thing for the country, as I see it, in the next few years.
So all of those things, I've heard Liz Truss talking about this, I've heard Danny Kruger talking about it, I've heard Matt Goodwin talking about leave the ECHR, reform the civil service, reform the Human Rights Act. It seems to be something, the ideas are there, but the political will maybe seems not to be, but is it even that simple? Even if say, for example, the Conservatives did get back in and they had a stonking majority, as they did before, is it that simple that these things can just be done with political will, or is there something more nefarious than that going on? Have we passed? I've heard Liz Truss talking about the fact that we have a democratic deficit because the judiciary has been politicised, the civil service has taken over, and so on and so forth. Is it even possible to get back to that place to achieve Strexit, as it's sometimes called, to reform the Human Rights Act and so on? Is this possible?
Yes, it's possible. Right. I believe it's possible. It will be difficult. I wouldn't go as far as Liz does in talking about the deep state and so on. But there is definitely a presumption in the civil service, the Bank of England, the governing establishment class, that certain ideas are beyond the pale and not to be talked about. Now, it doesn't mean they won't deliver them. Nobody, almost no one in the civil service wanted Brexit, yet, in the end we got Brexit, albeit not perfect, because we drove it through and we had an electoral mandate and we drove it through. We had a referendum mandate. And you've just got to be clear about what you want to do, and it's got to be in the manifesto. We have to have a proper plan. It's not just talking about it. You need legislation, I think, for civil service reform. Most obviously, we need to know what we're going to do in overriding the treaties, getting out of the treaties. That's all got to be clear to everyone. So there's no argument about what does it all mean, what does this election victory mean, what's going to happen. That's all got to happen between now and election day, and after that it's got to be about delivery. And in a way that's part of the reason why the division on the right is so frustrating, because we're kind of arguing with each other rather than thinking about what needs to be done. But I do hope that will come. I really believe it can be done. We just need to be clear about it. And I suppose people get used to anything. The EU gets used to anything, the bureaucracy gets used to anything, the people of the country, the voters, get used to anything. And just take a kind of trivial example, Rachel Reeves's budget. 6 months ago she was saying there won't be any more tax rises. Depend on it, there aren't going to be any more. The last budget was the tax rises. We won't be doing that again. Now, she's been saying, actually, there are going to be tax rises. It's taken 3 months, but now that's what everybody expects. Everyone's got used to the idea there are going to be tax rises, and the debate is merely what kind and where are they going to hit. If you talk about stuff, people get used to it. And we need to talk about the things we want to do so people properly get used to our ideas as they have got used to the ECHR idea. Keep talking about it, keep getting people used to them so they don't seem strange, they don't seem weird, they seem natural, and simply looking for the right people to deliver them.
Thank you. One more question just before we open things up for Q&A. I wanted to ask you, just because it's such a huge political event of the last week or so, I wanted to ask you about the assassination, the murder of Charlie Kirk and some of the fallout that's occurred subsequently. I suppose in some ways it's a difficult thing to analyse from our perspective because we're on the other side of the pond, we're in Britain, and the political situation is quite different here. But it does seem like the spectre of political violence in the domestic sphere is raising its head again. One of the things that we've been seeing only in the last few days is seemingly a sort of right-wing version of cancel culture or something like that, where people who are saying the wrong things are being taken off air, or people are writing to their employers and so on and so forth. I suppose from your perspective as somebody with a great amount of experience in diplomacy, how do we create a more sort of peaceful politics in our nation? How can we avoid this kind of polarization and even if we disagree, work together towards better things?
So I've written about this actually in my Telegraph piece for tomorrow, but not everyone's got a Telegraph subscription, so I'll outline my theory, which is, first of all, that I'm not sure there's anything historically unusual in something like the Charlie Kirk murder. We have quite a truncated historical frame of reference nowadays, but you go back 100 years, you had the anarchist movement killing presidents and monarchs, putting bombs in place. You had the Joseph Conrad's Secret Agent. His novel was based on an anarchist attempt to blow up Greenwich Observatory in 1894. These things have been happening. We had the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Red Brigades. You always have, unfortunately, random violence in support of, distorted political causes. And that just seems to me that's kind of human nature, or it's evil in society. Whatever you think the reason is always there. So, this presumption that people have that it's something to do with social media and polarization and so on, I don't buy that. I think it's much deeper than that, and social media is a kind of excuse in this sort of thing. So I do think we need some perspective that, it's not possible for us all to prevent evil all the time, sadly, in this fallen world. I think, however, what is troubling is this willingness to defend it that we've seen so strongly. There have always been people who've defended, there were people who defended the Baader-Meinhof gang or whatever. There were people who defended the IRA. But it was always regarded as a bit beyond the pale as an opinion. Whereas now, it seems like there's quite a chunk of the left political spectrum, particularly, that thinks it's kind of okay. Or, at least to kind of, if not celebrated, at least to sort of say, well, he had it coming in some way, what do you expect? So, the kind of weasel words around it. And I do think in left-wing culture, there is a bit of the sort of glorification of the revolutionary, the Che Guevara, the violent person who's sort of standing against society, that is seeping into progressive opinion generally, and we're seeing it with this, and it is troubling. So I do think actually it's, to a large extent, it's for the left to kind of call out their own people who are behaving like this and saying this and saying, if you're celebrating Charlie Kirk's murder, then, you are beyond the pale of any normal political movement. And, I don't think cancel culture on the right is good. I don't want to see, us coming for people and their employers and telling them to lose their jobs. But I do want people to say what they think of people who say this, and in the most clear terms. These opinions should be stigmatized, and people should be embarrassed, ashamed, disgusted with themselves to find themselves voicing them. And that I think is how we get back to a better political culture, that certain opinions are just they're beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we've drifted into a world where that's not the case.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. No, that sounds a good way forward. Thank you, David, for all of that. That was wonderful. Now we're going to open things up. So this is where our lovely audience who are listening to this recording today are going to come in. So I'd like to ask you to ask your questions now. So if you wouldn't mind, please do put up your hand. I'll point to you. If you would stand up and enunciate your question very, very clearly for the recording, that would be extremely helpful. So who has a question to begin with? You, sir, over there, second row. Please stand. Absolutely, no problem at all.
Two questions, perhaps. One about assisted suicide, one about ECHR. On assisted suicide, I think it's very significant that a very large majority of palliative doctors are against the bill. Mm-hmm. Now, one might cynically say, well, of course they would be. They don't want to be put out of a job, do they? But that's exactly the point. That there is going to be a downgrading of palliative care. There is going to be a degradation of the hospice system. And more people are going to be in pain as a result of that. And the compassion argument just falls down, I think, on that point. Is that something that, an argument that is made strongly enough, do you think, David?
I mean, it certainly was made by quite a few in the Lords. And, people have identified this fact that, if palliative care, if hospices want public money, then they have to be prepared to kill their patients, bluntly. And most, I think, find that somewhat unsatisfactory, obviously. And I do think that, so yes, I think it's a part of it. Quite how, there's an obvious problem of finding more and more funding for healthcare that people are very well aware of. But yes, I think it is in the debate and quite a strong argument.
On the ECHR, 30 years ago I had personal reason to study the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights quite carefully, and at least at that time it was regarded as settled jurisprudence of the court that speech that was offensive, insulting, upsetting was protected by the convention. Now that may have changed, but it was certainly the case some years ago. If we scrap the ECHR for reasons largely to do with the politicisation of the civil service and the judiciary on the immigration issue, are we at risk of losing a protection against the nonsense that we see from the police just about every day? Is there a way of ensuring that protection?
The only way, I think, I'm not really expert in that side of the ECHR, but my impression is it's not as strong a protection on that subject as it used to be. But obviously it exists. I think, there is no protection other than our own common sense as a political culture and kind of reaching back to the traditions of the old British Constitution, the common law, the freedoms that came with it. And I think I think it is fundamentally kind of demeaning for a country to have to rely on outside judges to protect its fundamental rights. We should be able to do that for ourselves. We did do that for ourselves. Maybe there'll be a up and down if we do leave the ECHR, and some things will get worse before they get better. But I have enough confidence in our political system that in the end it'll get to the right answer, just as it did in the end on COVID. You know, it took 2 or 3 years, but in the end, the resistance to lockdowns in Parliament won out. You know, the argument won out, and I would hope that's what would happen this time.
Thank you. You, sir, in the second row there.
Lord Frost, in the House of Lords tomorrow, do you expect to get vocal support from the bishops?
On this particular subject, the bishops seem to have been, you know, pretty robust and pretty clear on what they think of it. Several of them have spoken. I think more will tomorrow, and they are clear. Dare I say it, unusually, they're framing it in explicitly Christian religious terms, which I'm afraid they don't always when they speak in the Lords. So yes, I hope so. I mean, the broader point is I do wish that we could have the bishops, if they speak, I think they ought to be bringing Christianity to the problem that they're discussing. If we're just hearing soft left politics, you know, with the occasional justification in Christian terms, but only being a justification, then they aren't really adding anything. You know, there are plenty of people like that in the Lords already. You know, what we do need is for them to bring something different, and the salt, the yeast that gets people thinking in a different way. And I think it is a great pity that we don't always hear that. I do hope it's not for me to comment on the affairs of the Church of England, but it would be so good to get a archbishop who could preach the gospel in an intelligible, a likeable way that got people to listen. I think that's what the country needs, and I really hope it happens.
Yeah. No, well, I thoroughly agree. I have nothing to add or demur in any way. So, yeah. Yes, we've got lots of hands. I was trying to pick a lady, but there is not a lady without. Oh, yes, in the first row.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I found it really easy to engage with everything you were saying the whole time. I think my question is going to refer to something you said near the end. I think I heard you say that you were not in favour of right of centre cancel culture, but I also heard you say very clearly that certain opinions should be beyond the pale. So I think my question relates to how can we square that circle? What do you see as the difference between cancel culture and how we would respond to opinions that are beyond the pale? And my head is even thinking of how excommunication is the Christian concept of that's beyond the pale, you're outside now, and the purpose of it all was actually to try and help the person understand that there was a consequence of that and to draw them back in.
Yes.
So it wasn't so much a punishment as a teaching method to help them learn, actually you've gone too far. And you need to think about this, and you need to come back. So when I attempt to be charitable to people who, seize on cancel culture type methods, I think that's what they're trying. I think they're going, you need to think about it. And I also think, I'm a psychologist by training, and I think as well that it's also just a very human thing to do. When my child behaves in a way that displeases me, it's actually harder to engage with them. I have to draw deep on resources to want to engage with the person who has upset me. Yeah. So I think cancel culture is very understandable, and I suppose my question, just to be clear, is could you elucidate a little bit on the difference between how we would let people know it's beyond the pale but not fall into cancel culture?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I was kind of aware of that as I was speaking, and I think it is really difficult, I think, to draw abstract rules in these cases, to be honest. So much of it comes, or ought to come, just from kind of common sense and a healthy political culture and debate, and unfortunately we don't really have that properly at the moment. I think, I mean, when I say cancel culture, what I don't like is just like some guy who says something on social media, he's just an ordinary person or an ordinary woman, all of a sudden the world turns on him, he loses his job, his life is ruined, he didn't expect any of this, he wasn't up, to participate in the formal public square, but all of a sudden, this has all descended on him, and I don't like that if it comes from the right or the left. The guy at the other end of the spectrum was the guy, I forget his name now, the guy Trump was talking about today on one of the US news networks, who claimed that the shooter of Charlie Kirk was MAGA supporter. And as far as I can see, that's just wrong. And he's lost his job because he was on a mainstream news channel and said something that simply was not correct. So I would expect there to be some kind of consequences for that in the mainstream. So that's kind of at the other end of the spectrum. And then I suppose you've got somebody like, this guy at the Oxford Union who's attracted a lot of attention, where, his remarks seem to have been somewhat in private rather than going out on X and projecting them. He's still young, he's obviously a bit misguided in many ways. I don't really like people piling in and saying he must lose his job, but I do think it's appropriate for people who, the board of the Oxford Union, members to resign if they want to, people not to show up for debates if they don't want to signal what they think in that way. So a lot of this is just like so case specific, but I think we should probably err on the side of charity, I feel, and I'm not sure I'd want everything I said aged 18 or 20 to be recorded and debated years later, and I just think we should try and be charitable while making clear, what we think of what's been said. I suppose that's best I can do, really.
On this issue of cancel culture, I was actually listening to Louise Perry's podcast today, which she did on this with Nina Power. They had a very, very interesting discussion about these issues, and it just became clear to me that this specific type of cancel culture that we're talking about, I think, is actually a kind of it's what would you call it? It's a kind of protocol. It's a tactic that people use to destroy their enemies, and Louise Perry was saying that her worry is, or well, let me put it this way. She was saying that she thinks that the attempts of people on the right to get people on the left cancelled now are indicative of the fact that people on the right would use cancel culture if they could, if they were powerful enough, and now in fact they have become powerful enough. So she was saying that she thinks it's actually indicative of the fact that the right is in the ascendancy, then it can actually engage in cancel culture. So that's just an observation, but I suppose my sort of feeling about that is very similar to yours, which is that I think that we ought to be above these things. I don't think we should use the same kind of underhanded tactics as our political opponents. I've been, in a small way, a victim of cancel culture on Twitter, as it was when it happened to me, and it's a really unpleasant thing to have people report you to your employers, to try and get you in trouble, to get you, put through various meetings and awkwardness and difficulty and everything like that. It really is just a horrible thing to do to somebody. It's horrible and nasty, and we should be above it. And I quite agree with you. There's a difference between that and the natural consequences that somebody has to face in a professional or an educational context for their inaccurate or unpleasant statements. I mean, I think about this guy at the Oxford Union, for example. If you were at secondary school and you made comments like that and somebody found out, you would get in trouble. You would be in the headmaster's office, and nobody would say, or the student can say, well, this is cancel culture, I'm a political victim or something like that. It's actually a conduct issue. It's not a speech issue, it's a conduct issue. And I see that as different to those kind of underhanded tactics that people engage in on X and things like that. And I would hope people on the right, conservatives and others, Christians, wouldn't do things like that. Yeah. Whale at the back.
Regarding your aversion to the term nationalist or Christian nationalist, or even political parties being overtly Christian because of the modern attitude to it, do you not see a problem with accepting the viewpoint of your opponents as a given?
Yes, one shouldn't always do that. I think the word nationalist and nationalism has just become too tainted in Europe, at least. I don't know about in the US, it doesn't seem to have quite the same connotations, but in Europe I think it's just irremediably tainted, as you know, Hitler, World War, all this sort of stuff. And I think there's no point in, sometimes there's just no point in kind of turning people off before you've even started, just because you're using the wrong words, and you should try and find words that do make your case. And that's why I try to talk about nationhood and the nation and the nation state. If we had a word for nation statism as opposed to nationalism, that's kind of what I would think. The nation state is a good thing, but not implying that, like any individual nation state, is inherently superior to any other. And that, unfortunately, is the connotation that nationalism has for a lot of people, and that's why it's as a word, it's probably better avoided. But it is a word. It's the underlying concept that matters.
Yes. I have a copy of Yoram Hazony's book, The Virtue of Nationalism, on my bookshelf, which I hide when various diocesan officials come over, because I don't want them to get the wrong impression.
A bit Brexity, that
Yeah,
one.
exactly. Exactly. But one of the things Hazony does in that book is he tries to make the point that, Hitler was not a nationalist; he was an imperialist.
That's right.
He was a man who sought to extend his empire over other nations, and so in some ways the very opposite of a nationalist. But I suppose what you're saying is, well, it doesn't matter semantically; the damage has already been done.
Yes, that's right. We need the words that convey effectively the concepts we're trying to get people behind.
Yeah, exactly. I'm only joking. I don't hide my books when diocesan officials come over. Other people, you sir in the front row.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about abortion. The Catholic Church has been brilliant at opposing it. The Church of England has been pathetic. And it links to the issue of demography, which is very much in the news at the moment. This country is going to become extinct in the not too distant future through lack of babies.
Yeah. It is very interesting that nobody ever talks about that when the fertility crisis is debated. However many it is, 250,000 babies that are lost to abortion every year in this country. I'm personally against abortion. Actually, I always have been. And, it's interesting that there are people in the Labour Party, from the socialist tradition, who are against abortion as they're against assisted dying, because, for kind of humanist reasons, and they think life is important.
Christopher Hitchens was like that, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I might sort of, if you really interrogate the philosophical presumptions that underlie that, you might sort of question, but nevertheless, they're held and important. And I do this latest amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill that decriminalises abortion right up to birth is extremely troubling for all sorts of reasons. I still have some hope we might be able to reverse it, or at least do weaken it in some way in the Lords, but I'm not sure. Again, I can't speak for the Church of England, but I did notice with the Bishop of London, I think, so put out a statement that was a bit equivocal on the question, to say the least.
Yeah. I can't remember the details of it, but it was quite mealy-mouthed. And this would be an issue where you would say, in contrast to the way the bishops have spoken with, I would say, a significant moral clarity over the issue of assisted suicide, they I would say they never speak about the issue of abortion. This recent amendment has been the only time in my memory that I've actually heard a bishop even address the issue. And I think it's an egregious failure on the part of the bishops to not address this, which to me is one of the most significant, if not the most significant, moral question of our time. So it's interesting, isn't it, to ask the question, why are they willing to speak about assisted suicide? Why is that okay at the moment to speak about and not abortion? And it does rather raise the possibility that were assisted suicide to become normalized, would they stop talking about that as well because it becomes too awkward to do so? So that would be my concern over it.
Yes, I mean, I don't know what motivates the bishops on this particular question or why they come to the judgments they do. I do think that it is, it is awkward to oppose abortion, and not just on the progressive left. In part, a lot of the right, it's awkward to oppose it. And I think there's a lot of just sort of social convenience and, a wish to perhaps also a wish to, a belief that the issue is basically settled and there are more important things to kind of fight on because they'll never win. That may also be part of it, but that's not really moral clarity.
No, it's not. I think also there is something perhaps even benign about it, which is a pastoral concern for people, which is very, very legitimate, of course. Which is to say that people have engaged in abortion now, people have had abortions now, and to speak against it is in a sense to speak against the actions that those people have undertaken. So once it's become something that is legal and is widely practiced, then it becomes so much harder to speak about as a moral issue. We're not in that place yet with assisted suicide, but if it becomes legal, we will be at some point. So it'll be an interesting question to see how things develop from there. Yeah. Okay, other questions? Let's have Bernie all the way at the back.
Good evening. I've got two questions, so I'm going to ask them because I'll ask them one at a time. Maybe that's what.
Let's have them both at once.
Okay, both at once, right. So I'm sort of trying to test the permeability of the Westminster bubble with this first one. Those of us that only listen to legacy media, mainstream media, may not be aware how much damage was done through lockdown, through the almost enforcement of jabs, through the lack of safety and effectiveness of the jabs during COVID, and through the lasting impact that's had on mental health in terms of jobs and everything else. Labour and Tory were quite good at outdoing each other on supporting the next bit of legislation or order that came in to restrict movements and to get close to enforcement. The Reform Party was lucky in the sense that it wasn't quite in that league, although some of them had similar beliefs. So I guess the first question is, A, how much is that a recognition factor in your circles, in the Lords, and in government from your perspective, and what impact is that going to have on the next election in terms of people thinking maybe reform was more aware of what's going on and could be there. The second is, I don't know how aware politicians or ministers are of how close some parts of the UK are to a flashpoint that could lead to civil strife, civil war. I don't know how much there are, but if you go out of legacy media and look at what's happening up in the north in some of these towns, with the rape gangs, with the Sharia law that's being imposed on people, we're very close to tinderbox status in some of those, and I don't exaggerate. I think if you look outside that, I don't know again how aware people are of that and what in reality is being done to try to deal with that. And the answer is so far nothing, but I think it's a major factor in the next election.
Okay, let me try and deal with those. The lockdowns generally. I mean, the interesting thing to me about the lockdowns, whichever aspect one's talking about, is just how little they come into political public debate. I mean, it's like all this debt that we've got has just kind of materialized somehow, not connected to any policy decisions that were taken. The mental health so-called crisis, however one interprets it. Again, sometimes people make the connection with lockdowns, sometimes they they don't, school attainment, the workless, the trend to kind of stay on benefits forever and not work. All these things seem to me to be connected to it. And there's, on the vaccine question, I don't know. I've never really engaged in that particular aspect of the debate. But what is striking to me is that we seem unwilling to kind of just have a discussion of it. I'm perfectly prepared to believe, I think it is what I believe, that vaccines were largely effective and safe but had some side effects. Why can't we discuss exactly what that means and the effects that it had? It's like it's a subject that gets you stigmatized, and it shouldn't be. So I think all this, I think politicians just want to pretend that it never happened, I think, to a large extent, and so do a lot of voters as well, I think. And in fact, the latest polling I saw said that something like 60% of people would quite happily have another lockdown if they thought. So, in a way, that is definitely not true of the political class. You don't often find politicians who are willing to say, the lockdowns were a good thing. So maybe the kind of disconnect actually, works in the opposite direction to usual on this. So I just think it's one of those great unacknowledged things. It was a national disaster, obviously, the way we handled it. We'll be dealing with the consequences for years and years. The least we can expect is to have a proper reckoning, but it doesn't seem that we're going to get it, and that's just the way politics is, unfortunately. On the second question, I mean, I think politicians are aware, worried, nervous about the state of the country in certain areas. I think they are aware of the fragility, and that's a bit why Starmer cracked down so hard last summer, and I would expect the government to do the same again if similar things happened, because they have to maintain public order. I think they're aware of it. My suspicion is that people attribute different causes to it. That on the left it's sort of far right agitators and so on who are the cause of it, and on the right it's kind of woke policemen and social workers who've let all this go past for years, and now it's the consequence. I don't think we really know. I think there is a generalized unhappiness in the country that comes in part from the fact the economy stopped growing, and we're in a zero-sum economy, and a lot of people are getting poorer, and partly from cultural decline, decline in excellence, decline in sort of traditional values and culture, and people are sensing that and reacting to it, and it shows up in different ways in different places. But I think it's just a very unhappy country at the moment, unfortunately.
Thank you. Any more questions from anybody? Sarah in the check shirt there.
So, with you mentioned the point about wanting to put Christianity back into our political culture. With the House of Lords representing a lot of that today, do you see a possible future reform government with Nigel Farage's hostility to the Lords as a threat to that?
Well, my personal view is that, I mean, on the two questions, I think, obviously, I would like to see Christian values, overt Christian argumentation, being made by all politicians, or a lot more politicians anyway, to come to believe it and make those arguments, whether it's in the Lords, the Commons, kind of wherever. I think that's the way to bring it back. People just got to be more comfortable talking about it in all kinds of settings and environments. I don't think it's only the Lords. I think I'm certain that the share of Christians in the Lords is higher than in the general population. It might be true in the Commons as well, actually, but it's certainly true in the Lords. But I think that's a different question from what should happen to the House of Lords, which I would say, it is reached the point where it does need some sort of reform now, in my view. I don't know what, and that's always been the problem, that there's no consensus on what to replace it with or how to reform it. I do think that it's become too many, because of Brexit mainly, I think too many members of the Lords have come to see it as a kind of constitutional court Mark II, a kind of check, a representative of establishment conventional wisdom opinions about everything, and a restraint for that on the government. And I don't think you can have that very easily from an unelected house. If you elect people who have those opinions, that's different. But if it's largely just politicians who've reached the end of their careers, or people who've just arrived for slightly random reasons, like me, because they had to be a minister and it was the only way, I don't think it's really good enough. And you need more legitimacy for it to be an effective second chamber. And if you think we should have a second chamber, then we really should be having a proper debate about it. And this is why so many people in my party are unhappy about the kicking out of the hereditary peers. Not because they think hereditary peerage is a good basis for a modern legislature. I don't think many people do think that, but because it seems like a kind of random reform undertaken for political reasons without any wider debate and no sense of what the House of Lords is going to be when it's done. And we deserve better than that as a country, I think, for one of our two houses of Parliament. But again, I'm not sure we're going to get it.
Well, thank you for that, David. I think we have come to the end of our time this evening, but I'd just like to say thank you so much. We've really given you a grilling there on all sorts of issues, some of them very, very controversial. I think you've answered them excellently. So thank you so much. Lord Frost, shall we give him a big round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.